Dear students, this short video is about pedigree. Pedigree is a diagram of a family history that uses certain standardized symbols, which carries information and makes it possible to determine how certain alleles are inherited, whether autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive or sex-linked. As we see here, certain shapes and symbols. Let's start. The square represents male all the time. The circle represents female all the time. If we have shaded female, I mean circle, that means this female is affected with that gene. If we have shaded square, that means this male is affected. If we have half shaded, it means this is a carrier. And the same thing applies for the female. Also, for the Roman numerals that on the left side representing the generations. So this is the first generation, this is the second, and if we have more here, it will be the third. For the numbering here, the Arabic numerals, this is for individuals. Regarding the horizontal and vertical lines, the horizontal represent the marriage. Vertical means we have now moving from one generation to another, and these branches with the same line representing the siblings. Let's start talking about the inheritance of recessive orders. Look at this pedigree. As we see here, they mentioned that the parents, they are carriers. Let me remind you by something. We have mainly three genotypes. We have homozygous dominant, 2 capitals. We have heterozygous dominant, 1 capital, 1 small allele. And we have homozygous recessive. Now, when they are telling you a carrier, what does that mean? That means this person is not showing the symptoms of that disorder, but still is carrying the recessive allele. Which allele I'm talking about? I'm talking about the recessive allele. So the genotype for the carrier is heterozygous all the time, in which case, in the case of recessive disorders only. Okay? And that I'll clarify it more when we talk about the dominant genetic disorder. Now, these are the carriers. Look at their kids. We can notice that generation 2, male number 1, generation 2, female number 2, generation 2, male number 4, all are normal, unaffected. And who is affected? Number 3, she's a female. Why? Because she took from her mom one recessive allele, and she took from her dad another recessive allele. That's why she is now affected. What about her sister or her brothers? They did not take the 2 recessive alleles from their parents. So let's agree, when we have a recessive inheritance for disorders, the only case that we have affected person is having what? The homozygous recessive. If we have heterozygous, they are carriers. They look normal, but they are still carrying the recessive allele. But if their genotype is homozygous dominant, that means they are normal 100%. Now, for dominant genetic disorders, as we see here, we don't have half shaded. What does that mean? We don't have carriers. Why? In Mendel's law, we learned that something that it's enough to have one dominant allele to be expressed. So, as we see here, the mother is affected and the father is normal. The mother, she has 2 options to show the symptoms. The first one, if she has homozygous dominant genotype or heterozygous. In recessive, heterozygous was what? Carrier. because they are carrying the recessive allele. But here, because it's enough to have one dominant allele to be affected. What about father? He has only one option, which is homozygous recessive. Okay, look at their kids. Their kids, only 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. For 7, this is the husband of 6. For 1, this is the husband of 2. Now, we have 2 and 5 affected. What does that mean? That means they took from their father the recessive allele, and they took from their mother what? The dominant. That's why 2 and 5 are affected. Now, what about the 3, 4, and 6? They took for sure, and this is the only option to give it to their kids from their dad, is the the recessive allele, and because they are unaffected, for sure they took from their mom what? Also the recessive allele. So their genotype 6 and 4 and 3 is what? The homozygous dominant. But for 2 and 5, they took also from their dad the recessive allele, but unfortunately, they took from their mom what? The dominant allele. So they are heterozygous, but their phenotype showing the disorder. Why? Because it's an inheritance of dominant disorder. Now, let's practice what we learned. Now, let's answer this question. Identify the patterns of inheritance of the studied disorder in the pedigree. Explain your answer. Now, we don't know if it's recessive or dominant. How we will know without mentioning in the question what is it? We have 2 clues here. First of all, as we see, 1 and 2 are normal, despite in generation 2 we have affected and carriers. So the first clue, when we have a skipped generation without being affected, this is a sign for recessive. What about the second clue? As you see here, we have a carrier. Also here, once we have a carrier, that means it is a recessive disorder. So I have 2 clues. The first one, skipped generation, without affecting any person. The second one, when we have carriers. So the right answer here, it is what? It is recessive disorder. Okay? The second question. Identify the genotype of the 2 parents of generation 1 in the pedigree. So we will identify the genotype of 1 and 2 here. Directly we'll go to their kids. Look, we have 2 male carrier, 3 male affected, 4 male normal. So they have affected, normal, and carrier. What does that mean? The only case that the recessive is affected is what? To have 2 recessive alleles. But once we have their kids here, for example, 5, this is the genotype. I'm taking a letter, it's up to you to take which letter, okay? But for this 4, number 4 is normal. So I am assuming that he is homozygous dominant. For 2 is a carrier. So its genotype is heterozygous, as we agreed before. Can you see? We have recessive alleles, we have dominant alleles. So they took one from their mom and dad. Directly, once the mom and dad give dominant and recessive, and at the same time they are not affected, so directly I will understand that they are both of them carriers. Why? Carriers because 5 and 3, they are affected. That means they took from one of them the recessive allele and the other recessive allele from other parents. So one will give A small, 2 will give another A small, to have 3 and 5 affected. At the same time, 4 is what? normal. So they gave the dominant, one from mom, from dad here, and the other one from mom. If you look at 2, which is carrier, you will find, yes, they took one dominant allele and one recessive. What does that mean? That both parents are heterozygous. Both of them, they have the different alleles. So both, they have recessive and dominant. So they are heterozygous. Let's do question number 3. Suppose that individual generation 3, number 3, the carrier male, so directly I will write the genotype beside it, A capital, A small, because it's heterozygous, is married to an affected individual. What does that mean? Affected here means recessive, homozygous, recessive individual with this disorder. Predict the probability that their children to be affected by the disorder. Directly, I will draw what? The Punnett square in a simple way. Okay, so the first parents, number 3, A capital, A small. The second one, A small, A small. So let's do it in a simple way as I'm doing it right now. What we can see, we have 2 carriers and 2 affected. So according to the question, I have 50% affected and 50% carriers. So the answer is 50%. Let's move to this question. Use the pedigree below, which shows the inheritance of a disorder called achondroplasia in 2 families, to answer questions below. Now, identify whether achondroplasia is inherited as a recessive trait or as a dominant trait. As simple as that, from my side, I know it's a dominant, but imagine if I don't. I will look. Each generation, they have affected person. This is the first clue. The second one, I don't have carriers. So directly I will understand that this is a dominant disorder. Okay? Now, second one, identify the genotype of the 2 parents A and B in family 1. Here you go. Now, B, very simple and easy because it's unaffected and this is dominant. What does that mean? We have only one option, which is A small, homozygous dominant. What about A? The father. Let's look at their kids. We have some of them affected and the other unaffected. For sure, they will take from their mom one small letter, all of them. Fine, all of them, because one allele from mom, one allele from dad. The dad, without looking for the children, he has 2 options. Maybe homozygous dominant to be affected or heterozygous. And he will give a pass for each one of his kids, regardless male or female, one allele. If we assume that he's homozygous dominant, so all the time he must pass what? The dominant allele. At that time, all the kids must be affected, like the first girl and the third male, boy. But we can see the second male here, and E, also a girl, normal. What does that mean? That means they have a recessive allele. From where? From their dad. So the first one, they took it from their mom. The second allele, recessive allele, they took it from their dad. So the first option is wrong, because if we have it homozygous dominant, all of them, they should be affected. But what we see, we have half of them affected, half of them what? Normal. So the genotype of the father is heterozygous, and for the mother, she is normal, which is homozygous. Recessive. If the 2 individuals, E and F, this E and this is F, get married, then determine the probability for them to have a child that has achondroplasia. As simple as that. Both of them are normal, as you see, clear. So let me draw the Punnett square in a simple way. I'll use this area, even if it's small. Okay. So E is a small, also F, a small, normal, homozygous recessive. So all their kids will come normal. What does that mean? The probability to have achondroplasia in their children is what? 0%. Okay, so the answer here is 0. No chance to have an affected children. Hopefully you understood the two concepts of autosomal dominant disorders and autosomal recessive disorders. Thank you.